The knock came at exactly midnight, 3 loud, deliberate pounds that made my heart jump into my throat. I was in my silk robe, face mask on, about to open a bottle of wine and watch Netflix in the penthouse apartment that my generous benefactor had provided for me. When I opened the door, I expected maybe a neighbor with a noise complaint or a lost delivery driver. What I got instead was a well-dressed woman in her 50s holding up her phone with a photo of me and her husband. And the words that would destroy my entire life, "We need to talk about Richard. My name's Jessica, and for 2 years, I was a sugar baby. Before you judge me, let me explain how I got there, because I never imagined this would be my life. I was 24, fresh out of college, with a degree in marketing that seemed worthless in the real job market. I was working 2 jobs, a coffee shop during the day and bartending at night, and still couldn't afford rent in the city. My studio apartment was tiny, my student loans were crushing me, and I watched all my friends from college posting about their corporate jobs and nice apartments, while I could barely afford groceries. One night at the bar where I worked, an older, attractive man started talking to me. His name was Richard, or so, he said. He was probably in his early 50s, well-dressed, confident, and he tipped me $200 on a $50 tab when he came back the next week and the week after that, always sitting at my section, always leaving ridiculous tips. I started to wonder if this was going somewhere. Then one night, he waited until my shift ended and asked me to dinner. Not at the bar, but at one of those restaurants where you need a reservation 6 months in advance over a meal that costs more than my monthly rent. He laid out what he called a proposition. "I'm a very busy man," he said, swirling his wine glass. "I travel a lot for business, I work long hours, and I don't have time for traditional relationships. But I enjoy companionship, and I'd like to have someone I can spend time with when I'm in town. Someone I can take to dinners, events, someone to travel with occasionally." I wasn't naive. I knew what he was suggesting. "You want a sugar baby." He smiled. "I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial arrangement. I provide financial support, and you provide your time and company, nothing more than you're comfortable with, of course. Everything would be clearly discussed and agreed upon up front. I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about it for weeks. The moral implications, the judgment I'd face if anyone found out, whether I could really separate emotions from what would essentially be a transactional relationship. But every time I looked at my bank account, at the student loan notices, at my cramped apartment, and my exhausting schedule, the decision became clearer. Richard's offer was generous, $5,000 a month, plus he'd pay for a better apartment for me, cover my car payment, and give me an allowance for clothes and necessities. In exchange, I'd be available when he was in town, usually 2 weekends a month, for dinners, events, or just spending time together. He was clear that intimacy might be part of it, but only if I was comfortable, and it would always be my choice. "I want you to feel taken care of, not obligated," he said during one of our planning meetings. Yes, we had meetings. He approached the whole thing like a business arrangement, which actually made me feel safer. Everything was discussed, boundaries were set, and he even had me review a contract with a lawyer he paid for. Looking back, that contract should have been my first red flag. But HE 24 and desperate, I signed it. The first few months were surreal. Richard set me up in a beautiful 1-bedroom apartment in a luxury building downtown. Not a penthouse yet, that came later, but compared to my studio, it was paradise. He took me shopping and told me to get a wardrobe appropriate for the places we'd be going. I walked out of designer stores with bags I'd only ever dreamed about. Our first official date was a charity gala where tickets cost $10,000 each. I wore a designer dress, had my hair and makeup professionally done, and spent the evening on the arm of a man who introduced me as his companion to people who seemed to understand exactly what that meant. Nobody judged. In that world, arrangements like ours were apparently common. For the first year, everything was exactly as Richard had promised. He was respectful, never pushed boundaries, and was genuinely good company. He told me about his tech business, something about consulting for major companies on digital transformation. He traveled constantly for work, which is why he was only in town a couple of times a month. The money was like, I paid off my student loans, I got a newer, reliable car. I could finally breathe financially, and yes, I enjoyed the lifestyle, the expensive restaurants, the weekend trips to Miami or Las Vegas, the events where I rubbed elbows with people I'd only seen in magazines. Richard upgraded me to a penthouse apartment after about 8 months. "You deserve to live somewhere that reflects your worth," he said, handing me the keys. The place was stunning, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, modern furnishings, a kitchen I barely knew how to use because we always ate out. I even traveled internationally with him a few times, a weekend in Paris, where he had business meetings but made time to take me to the Louvre and the Eiffel Tower. A week in Tokyo, where everything felt like a dream. He always booked separate hotel rooms, giving me my own space, which I appreciated. My friends started asking questions about my sudden lifestyle upgrade. I told them I'd gotten a really good marketing job, which wasn't entirely untrue. I did pick up some freelance work to maintain appearances, but the truth was, Richard was funding my entire life, and I was becoming dependent on that in ways that made me uncomfortable when I really thought about it. About 18 months into our arrangement, small things started feeling off. Richard became more secretive about his schedule. He'd cancel plans last minute, sometimes just hours before we were supposed to meet. When I'd call him, he'd often not answer, then text me later with apologies about being in meetings. His gifts became more extravagant but also more random. A $15,000 Cartier bracelet just because, a Louis Vuitton trunk that seemed excessive even for our arrangement. When I thanked him, he'd just wave it off. "I like taking care of you," he'd say. But there were moments that felt strange. Like when we were at dinner and he excused himself to take a call, and I heard him speaking in a different tone, sharper, more urgent than I'd ever heard from him. Or when we traveled and he'd insist on paying for everything in cash, even large purchases. One time, I found a prescription bottle in his jacket pocket with a different name on it, Michael Thornton. When I asked him about it, he laughed it off. "That's my business partner." I was picking up his medication for him since I was near the pharmacy. Then there was a time I suggested connecting on social media, and he got genuinely upset. "I keep my personal life very private, Jessica. I thought you understood that people in my position can't afford to have their private arrangements public." At the time, it made sense. He was a wealthy businessman. Of course he'd want privacy. But looking back, I should have questioned why a man who supposedly had a legitimate tech consulting business had virtually no online presence at all. The biggest red flag came about 6 months before everything fell apart. We were in his car, a leased Mercedes that he explained he preferred owning because it was better for taxes, and his phone rang. The caller ID said, "Home." He looked at it, his face going pale, and declined the call. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Finey. Just a marketing call." They somehow got through my spam filter. But I'd seen how he looked at that phone. That wasn't annoyance at a spam call. That was fear. Despite these occasional odd moments, I settled into the lifestyle. I hate admitting this, but I became comfortable with being taken care of. The financial security, the lack of stress about money, the ability to buy things without checking my bank account first. It was addictive. I even started justifying the arrangement to myself in new ways. Richard and I had developed genuine affection for each other, or so I thought. We'd have long conversations about life, dreams, fears. He seemed to really care about me as a person, not just as a transaction. He encouraged me to pursue my marketing career and even helped me get freelance clients through his connections. Looking back, I wonder how much of his caring was real and how much was manipulation to keep me invested in the arrangement. I moved further into his world and further away from my old life. My friends from college who'd been skeptical about my sudden wealth started drifting away. I made new friends in the circles. Richard introduced me to other young women in similar arrangements, people who understood and didn't judge. We'd meet for brunch and talk about our benefactors like they were regular boyfriends, ignoring the financial foundation of our relationships. My family thought I was doing well in marketing and that I'd landed some big clients. I sent them money sometimes, paid for my mom's medical bills when she got sick, helped my brother with his car repair. In my mind, I was using Richard's generosity to help people I loved, which made it feel more justified. But deep down, I knew I was living a lie. Every time someone asked about my boyfriend or why I was single, I had to dance around the truth. Every time Richard canceled plans and I'd spend the weekend alone in my penthouse, I'd feel the emptiness of the arrangement. This wasn't real love or a real relationship. This was a business deal that I'd dressed up in my mind as something more meaningful. The beginning of the end started with small inconsistencies that I tried to ignore. Richard started giving me cash more often instead of transferring money to my account. "Tax reasons," he'd explained. "It's better this way for both of us." His visits became less frequent. Instead of twice a month, it was maybe once a month. And sometimes he'd only stay for a few hours. "Business is crazy right now," he'd say. "Big deals in the works." Then the credit card started getting declined. The first time it happened, I was at a salon get my hair done. Something Richard had always paid for with a credit card he'd given me specifically for maintenance expenses. The card was declined, and I had to awkwardly pay with my own money and text Richard about it. So, sorry. He texted back. Banking error. I'll have it fixed by tomorrow and reimburse you. He did reimburse me, but it happened again 2 weeks later at a boutique. And again at a restaurant when I was out with friends. Each time, Richard had an explanation. Banking system updates, fraud protection being too sensitive, temporary holds while large transactions cleared. I started feeling anxious about money for the first time in almost 2 years. I had savings, but not enough to maintain the lifestyle I'd become accustomed to. The penthouse rent alone was $6,000 a month. Richard had always paid it directly, but what if he stopped? Then, about 3 weeks before the midnight knock, Richard disappeared. Completely. His phone went straight to voicemail. His texts went undelivered. The email address he'd given me bounced back. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. I tried not to panic. Maybe it was a really intensive business trip. Maybe his phone had died or been lost. I waited 3 days before I started really worrying. After a week, I was terrified. Not just about Richard, but about my rent that was coming due, about the car payment, about everything. I called the building management to ask if Richard had paid the rent. That's when I got the first piece of truly alarming information. Richard wasn't on the lease. The lease was in my name only. And there was a note that rent payments may come from various sources on tenants' behalf. I pulled out the lease documents I'd signed 2 years ago when I moved in. I'd been so excited about the apartment that I hadn't read carefully. Richard had explained that putting it in my name was for privacy reasons, and I'd just accepted that. Now, I saw that I was fully responsible for the rent, and there was no mention of Richard or any arrangement with him anywhere in the legal documents. Which brings us back to that midnight knock. The woman at my door was impeccably dressed, probably in her early 50s, with the kind of polished look that comes from money and maintenance, but her eyes were hard and... "I'm Catherine," she said, pushing past me into the apartment before I could respond. Catherine Thornton, Richard's wife of 28 years. My brain struggled to process those words. Wife, 28 years. I think you have the wrong person. I started, but she held up a phone, showing me a photo of me and Richard at a restaurant, then another photo of us at the gala, then a photo of him handing me shopping bags. I've been following my husband's little hobby for about 6 months now, she said, her voice dripping with contempt. You're not the first. You're just the longest lasting one. I felt sick. He told me he wasn't married. He said, let me guess, he's a tech consultant, travels a lot for business, has a company that does digital transformation. Her laugh was bitter. Richard doesn't work in tech. He doesn't have a company. What he has is a very generous trust fund from his father and absolutely no impulse control. She walked around my penthouse like she owned it. Let me tell you what else Richard has. He has a gambling addiction that has cost us millions. He has a gift for manipulating young women into thinking they're special. And he has access to accounts that aren't actually his anymore, thanks to his recent bankruptcy filing. My head was spinning. Bankruptcy. Oh, he didn't mention that. Richard filed for bankruptcy about 8 months ago. Everything we had is gone. The house, the cars, the investments, all seized or sold to pay creditors. This apartment, she gestured around. I'm guessing he told you he was paying for it. But according to my investigation, he hasn't paid rent here in 3 months. You're about to be evicted, sweetie. That's impossible. He just gave me, I thought about the Cartier bracelet, the Louis Vuitton trunk, the gifts, were they bought with credit cards he stole from me or with money he embezzled from family accounts before the bankruptcy. Catherine sat down on my couch, uninvited. That's actually why I'm here. I'm not concerned about you sleeping with my husband, honestly. You're welcome to him at this point. I'm here because you're in possession of stolen property bought with stolen money, and I need you to understand the legal situation you're in. Over the next hour, Catherine laid out everything. Richard, whose real name was actually Richard, at least that wasn't a lie, came from old money. His father had been a successful real estate developer who'd set up a trust fund for Richard that paid out a substantial monthly amount. For years, Richard had lived off this trust fund while pretending to have a successful business. But Richard had a serious gambling problem. He'd bet on sports, played high stakes, poker, made risky investments that were really just gambling in disguise. He'd blown through his trust fund and started accessing family accounts, Catherine's inheritance, their children's college funds, money from his mother's estate. When Catherine discovered what he'd been doing, she'd filed for separation and started legal proceedings to protect what little money was left. That's when Richard filed for bankruptcy, trying to shield some assets and claiming he'd been the victim of bad business deals. But he kept spending, Catherine said. The bankruptcy was supposed to be his wake-up call, but he just got He opened credit cards in my name, forged checks, and used his mother's accounts before anyone realized she wasn't mentally competent enough to notice. The apartments he'd set up for me and apparently other girls, all leased in our names with initial payments he'd somehow scraped together, but with no ongoing payment plan. The gifts, purchased with fraudulent credit cards or bought at high-end stores that he'd then never paid the bills for. The Cartier bracelet you're wearing right now, Catherine said, pointing at my wrist, was bought with a credit card he opened, using his elderly mother's identity. The store has already reported it as fraud. I felt like I might throw up. So none of it was real. The lifestyle was real. The money behind it was stolen. Catherine's expression soft slightly. Look, I don't think you knew. I've talked to 2 other girls he was supporting before you, and they were just as clueless, but ignorance isn't a legal defense. You're in possession of stolen property. You've been living in an apartment you can't afford under false pretenses. And if the authorities decide to press charges, you could be charged as an accessory to fraud. But I didn't know. I thought he was rich. I thought I believe you. But you did accept large sums of money and expensive gifts from a man without ever questioning where it came from or verifying anything about him. That's going to look bad too, investigators. Catherine pulled out a business card. This is my lawyer. He's going to call you tomorrow. You need to cooperate fully with the bankruptcy proceedings and return everything Richard gave you that can be traced to fraudulent purchase. The jewelry, the designer, goods, everything. You also need to be prepared to testify about your arrangement with Richard if it comes to that. What about this apartment? You have about 2 weeks before eviction proceedings start. I'd suggest you find somewhere else to live immediately. She stood up to leave, then turned back. One more thing. Richard is currently in hiding, probably in some casino in Atlantic City or Las Vegas, blowing through whatever money he managed to squirrel away. When they find him, and they wall, he's going to try to blame you and the other girls. He's going to claim you knew about the fraud, that you were accomplices. Maybe even that you pressured him into buying things. Don't let him make you the villain in his story. After she left, I sat in that beautiful penthouse that was never really mine and cried for hours. Not just because Richard had lied to me, but because I'd lied to myself. I'd ignored red flags, accepted money without asking questions, and built a lifestyle on a foundation that I'd known, deep down, wasn't solid. The next few weeks were a nightmare. Catherine's lawyer did call, and I spent hours in his office going through every gift, every payment, every detail of my arrangement with Richard. They itemized everything in the apartment, everything in my closet, even the car Richard had bought me, which turned out to be leased under an identity he'd stolen. I had to return almost everything. The jewelry went back to pay off fraudulent credit card charges. The designer clothes were sold to recoup some of the money owed to stores. Even furniture in my apartment that Richard had bought was seized as part of the bankruptcy proceedings. Then the police got involved. I was questioned multiple times about my relationship with Richard and what I knew about his finances. I hired my own lawyer using the little savings I had left, who advised me to cooperate fully and be completely honest about everything. The worst part was, when they started investigating whether I'd knowingly participated in the fraud, they looked at my bank records, my texts with Richard, even interviewed people I knew to see if I'd ever mentioned anything about his financial situation. For weeks, I lived in fear that I'd be charged as an accomplice. Eventually, they determined that I was a victim, not a perpetrator. The evidence showed I genuinely believed Richard was wealthy and had no knowledge of where the money actually came from. But that determination came after months of investigation and legal fees that wiped out what little savings I had. I moved out of the penthouse into a tiny studio apartment that reminded me painfully of where I'd started 3 years earlier. I sold everything I owned that Richard hadn't given me just to cover rent and legal fees. I went back to working multiple jobs, except now I was 3 years older and 3 years behind where I should have been in my career. The people in Richard's world, the other sugar babies, the social climbers, the hanger zone, all disappeared the moment the scandal broke. None of them wanted to be associated with fraud and bankruptcy. I was completely alone in dealing with the aftermath. My family found out the truth when the story made local news, local man charged with fraud, identity theft and elaborate scheme. The headline made it sound sensational. And while the article mentioned several young women Richard supported, it didn't name me, but my family saw Richard's photo and recognized him from pictures I'd posted on social media. The conversations with my parents were brutal. My mother cried. My father was angry and disappointed. They'd thought I was doing well, building a career, and instead I'd been, prostituting myself. That's what my father said. even though I tried to explain that it hadn't been like that. Richard was eventually caught in Las Vegas, arrested at a casino where he'd been using yet another stolen credit card. By that point, the charges against him were extensive: fraud, identity, theft, embezzlement, forgery. He'd stolen over $2 million from various sources over the course of about 5 years. At his trial, he did exactly what Catherine had warned me he'd do. His defense tried to paint the sugar babies, me and 3 other women they'd identified as known accomplices who'd encouraged his spending and possibly even blackmailed him. His lawyers presented text messages where we'd thanked him for gifts or mentioned needing money, trying to make it look like we'd been manipulating him. The prosecution tore that defense apart. They showed that Richard had been defrauding people long before any of us met him, that his pattern of supporting young women was part of his addiction and control issues, not something we'd instigated. They presented evidence of how he'd carefully hidden his real financial situation from everyone, including his wife. Richard was convicted and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. At his sentencing, he gave a speech about his gambling addiction and how he'd lost control of his life. He apologized to his wife and children, to his mother, to the creditors and stores he'd defrauded. He didn't apologize to me or the other women. We weren't even mentioned. It's been almost 3 years since that midnight knock. I'm 30 years old now, living in a modest 1-bedroom apartment that I pay for with money I earned from a legitimate marketing job and freelance work. I drive a used Honda instead of a leased luxury car. I buy my clothes from regular stores, not designer boutiques. And you know what? I'm okay. More than okay. Actually, I'm proud of myself for rebuilding my life, honestly. The experience changed me in ways I'm still processing. I learned that financial security built on lies is more dangerous than financial struggle built on truth. I learned that luxury without legitimacy is just another form of prison. I learned that I'm stronger than I thought I was, capable of surviving things I never imagined I'd have to face. I also learned some hard truths about myself. I'd been willing to compromise my values for comfort. I'd been willing to ignore red flags because the lifestyle was seductive. I'd been willing to exist in a transactional relationship because it was easier than building something real. The sugar baby lifestyle isn't inherently wrong. There are people who engage in those arrangements honestly, with clear boundaries and mutual respect. But my situation showed me the dark side of that world, the vulnerability it creates, the way it can be exploited, the ease with which financial dependence can trap you in situations you never intended to be in. I'm dating again, slowly. It's hard to trust people after Richard. Hard to believe anyone who seems too good to be true. But I'm learning to recognize healthy relationships, to value honesty over luxury, to build connections based on genuine compatibility rather than financial arrangements. My relationship with my family is still healing. They're trying to understand, and I'm trying to forgive myself for the choices I made and the lies I told. It's a slow process, but we're getting there. There's one thing I still think about constantly. At what point did I become complicit in my own deception? Richard lied to me, absolutely, but I also lied to myself. I convinced myself that the arrangement was just smart financial planning, that accepting money and gifts from a virtual stranger was somehow different than other forms of dependence. I told myself I was in control because I'd signed a contract, but really, I'd signed away my independence. I ignored obvious red flags because I wanted the lifestyle to be real. When Richard couldn't answer basic questions about his business, I accepted vague explanations. When he insisted on extreme privacy, I called it understandable caution. When credit cards started being declined, I believed his excuses because believing meant I didn't have to face the reality that my comfortable life was crumbling. Was I a victim? Yes. Yes. Richard deliberately deceived me and used stolen money to fund my lifestyle. But was I also complicit in my own victimization? Also, yes. I chose not to ask hard questions. I chose to accept the arrangement without verifying anything. I chose comfort over caution. That's the complexity that people don't always understand. You can be both a victim of someone else's deception and responsible for your own choices. Those two truths can exist simultaneously. I'm more careful now, almost too careful. Sometimes I verify everything, trust no one too quickly, and maintain my own financial independence like my life depends on it, because I learned that it does. I've also become more compassionate toward other people in complicated situations. Before this happened to me, I might have judged someone for being a sugar baby, for accepting money from a stranger, for prioritizing lifestyle over independence. Now, I understand how easy it is to make choices that seem reasonable in the moment, but catastrophic in hindsight. The women I met, through Richard's world, the other sugar babies, the ones who testified at his trial, the ones who lost just as much as I did. We've stayed in touch. We formed an unexpected support group, helping each other rebuild and reminding each other that we're more than the worst choices we've made. I'm also honest now in ways I never was before. When people ask about that period of my life, I tell them the truth. Not all the details, but enough to be authentic. I made some bad choices with money and trust. I say, I learned the hard way that shortcuts usually lead to longer detours. The marketing career I'd neglected while living off Richard's stolen money is finally developing legitimately. I'm building a client base through actual networking and good work, not through fake connections from a con artist. It's slower and harder than the easy money was, but it's mine. It's real. People often ask me if I regret the 2 years I spent with Richard. The answer is complicated. I regret the lies, the dependence, the way I compromised myself. I regret the pain I caused my family and the legal nightmare I went through. I regret that I was part of Richard's criminal activity, even unknowingly, but I don't regret everything. Those 2 years taught me lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. They showed me my capacity for self-deception and my ability to overcome devastating situations. They taught me the difference between financial security and financial dependence, between luxury and legitimacy, between comfort and happiness. Would I make the same choices again? Absolutely not. Would I trade the lessons I learned? I'm not sure. What I do know is this. The person I was at 24, desperate for financial security and willing to compromise to get it, is not the person I am now. I've paid a high price for that transformation, but I'm finally comfortable with who I see in the mirror. The penthouse apartment, the designer clothes, the luxury lifestyle, none of it was ever really mine. But the strength I developed surviving the aftermath, that belongs to me completely. So here's my question for all of you. If someone offered you financial security in exchange for compromising your values, would you take it? And more importantly, how do you know where the line is between accepting help and selling yourself? Because I thought I knew where that line was, and I was completely wrong. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Maybe your perspective will help someone else avoid the mistakes I made.